Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'd like to start the meeting and welcome you to Drinking Water 2020, the launch of the Chief Inspector's report on the quality of drinking water in England in 2020. My name is Laura Moss and I will be chairing today's presentation given by the Chief Inspector, Marcus Rink. Before we begin, though, could I just pass on a few points of information for our participants to make sure that it runs smoothly. We've got a lot of people online from what I can see. So just to make us run a little bit more smoothly, could you please ensure that you're on mute and turn your camera off for the duration of the presentation? And hopefully you'll be aware from the invitation that this presentation and the Q&A session are going to be recorded. During the presentation, though, we'd be really happy to take questions as we go through. If you put them into the chat function on Teams, then as we go through the presentation, I can collate them in the background and put them to Marcus at the end of the presentation. So hopefully we can cover all of them. And if you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation at any point, if you'd like to call DWI inquiries on the usual number or email them using our generic email address, they'll try and help you if they can. But if people are having real difficulties, we have made a copy of the slides available on our website from today, which hopefully you'll be able to follow, even if there are any difficulties in actually hearing or viewing the presentation. So as you're hopefully aware, the report was published on our website earlier this week. And let's just get on with it, and I'd like to hand over now to Marcus Rink, who will run through a presentation summarising the sort of key information and highlighting any points for learning. So if I could hand over to you, Marcus.
Yes, thank you very much, Laura, and I'll just share my slides and hopefully that will all come up. Right, so welcome. Thank you very much for attending this year's presentation for Drinking Water England 2020. This is, well, what can I say, the second remote presentation that I've done in the wake of the COVID pandemic. So hopefully this will all work and all the technology will work as we work our way through. So today I'm going to start off inevitably talking a little bit about a year in lockdown. And then following on with all the headings you see there on the presentation, which should be very familiar to all those who are attending today. So straight into talking about a year in lockdown. It certainly has been a very, very difficult year, largely starting around February, March, where everybody was asked to stay at home and protect the NHS and to wash your hands. And it's probably fair to say that that created some real special challenges for the water industry because obviously water supply had to be maintained, had to come through the pipes and out the taps all the time, which we know that there were difficulties associated with, for instance, food supply, and therefore water couldn't be in the same place. More importantly is the water companies had to maintain water quality because there's not much good producing water and sending water down pipelines if it doesn't meet the appropriate water quality standards. It'd be like asking you to buy a bottle of milk off the shelf of a supermarket and it's being brown, for instance. So it had to be maintained. And all of that had to be coped with by the water industry whilst dealing with the potential for staff to be sick. Now, over the year, I've got to say that the water industry did supply water all the time, and that was in the face of quite an increase in rise of demand of water. On average, about 30% was reported. A number of reasons were because people started to work at home, but also because people adopted habits such as buying pools and filling them up and putting them in their back garden. And I picked that particular pool there because it was available at a very cheap price and lots of people were filling it, including my neighbours, which of course created significant difficulty or demand for water companies. And I've got to say that as a top line, we have managed to produce a very high level of water quality throughout the year. And in that respect, the industry should be commended. Should be commended in maintaining supply, maintaining quality, maintaining all the people, the samplers, the laboratory staff, those on water treatment works, and all of the ancillary staff that support supplying water, which are often forgotten and have been forgotten over the last year, because water has always flowed from the tap. I talked about samplers, laboratories, analysts, and one of the things certainly that alerted me early on to some of the problems companies were experiencing is that I started actually receiving a few phone calls in February where one or two of the companies were saying, well, look, we're starting to have problems here because our samplers are turning up to properties and they're being turned away. And that's not there's other reasons as well, that of course samplers are people too, and they have their anxieties as well. So there was a real concern in terms of trying to get sampling, and from a water quality perspective, sampling gives us that assurance that the water quality is high and is maintained at a high level, and we prove that through our sampling. So what we did, and I'll move on to the next slide, which gives us a real understanding of what happened to taking samples, and that puts a whole context onto some of the data that I'm going to be talking about over this presentation. On the back of the reports by the companies or the phone calls that I was receiving, it became apparent that we needed to do something, and so we released Information Letter 1/2020, which talked about the potential opportunities for companies to overcome some of the issues that they were experiencing in terms of being able to get samples. And some of the suggestions around there was about reducing the randomness. Now, it's probably worth emphasising that the regulation makes no provision for such a situation. It was never foreseen. It makes no provision for companies not to sample in zones or water treatment works or service reservoirs. Companies must sample with a particular frequency and regularity stipulated by the regulations. The only provision that the regulation allows is for us, the drinking water inspector, to reduce the requirement for randomness in zones. However, when you put yourself into the position of the water company, and certainly what we were hearing, we did put into that information letter some flexibility so that companies could see what were the possibilities, whilst making it clear that the duty rests with the companies. So initially what we saw is in February, we saw a reduction in number of samples. You can see the red line, which is the average number of samples that we would expect month by month. And so the first impact was a drop in sampling in February. And then in March, when we reduced the information letter, companies started to use alternative, innovative strategies to try and take samples. And so those included some of the commercial premises, fixed points, outside points, service reservoirs, and that's depicted in here, particularly in orange, for those samples which we consider the surrogate. Tends to be more upstream samples at reservoirs. So companies started to move into that strategy in March. You can see at the height of the pandemic in April, May and June, a large proportion of samples were taken from surrogate samples before the company slowly recovered towards the end of the year. And so when you take the whole year overall, there was an average of 44 samples weren't taken in zones. But 2/3 of companies initiated innovative approaches, and that was really important, because what we saw is that some companies said, well, look, we've really got to get out and we've got to sample, and what are we going to do about it and how are we going to go about it? So we saw some companies which turned around and said, well, let's use our own staff's properties and houses as sample points. One company had a monthly raffle if they would allow their house to be a sample point. Another company approached businesses to have fixed sample points. Some used fixed sample points within zones, and others, as I say, has started to use outside taps. In normal times, outside taps wouldn't be acceptable, but it did create an ability for companies to take samples while protecting their staff and the householder as well. And that was an interesting point, because we'll come back to that a little bit later, and particularly it's some of the interesting bits that we've seen from that change in sampling and what that means. What we did is we needed to understand what the companies were doing and how they were doing it. So under a normal year, you would have the regulatory number of samples on the bottom, and on the y-axis to the left, you have the actual number of E. coli samples. Now, we've used E. coli because it's much better to simplify it to one parameter, particularly where that parameter is important. And under normal circumstances, if your actual sample numbers equal your regulatory samples, X equals Y, and so consequently you get that top line, that blue line, which is X equals Y. So that would be the perfect situation where companies took all the samples that they were due, and in a normal year we would expect that to happen. What companies did, as I said, some of the samples came from zones, water treatment works, service reservoirs, and so on, and that's represented by the red dots you see on the lower part of some of the companies. And where there's been a surrogate sampling, these have been added on to create the top dots, which are in orange towards the top. Now, what we did is we said, well, if we took that and we did a regression analysis, what's the difference between the samples that companies have taken and the regulatory requirement? And the regression analysis results in this middle grey line, and the 95 percentile confidence, lower confidence interval is in yellow. So what we would hope is that all companies would fall above that yellow line. When we looked at this, because we look at things statistically, companies, when you measure this line, the grey line against the blue line, statistically, there is no statistical difference in the number of samples. So whilst we can visualize on the graph that there is a visual difference, in statistical terms, there is no difference. So again, the company should be commended in that there was no statistical difference between the regulatory requirements and what they actually did. There were a couple of companies, Anglian Water and Thames Water, who accounted for 70% of the shortfall. And I'll talk a little bit more about Anglian Water. And you can see Anglian Water just here, if you can see the arrow of my mouse, and they are just below the yellow line. So between Anglian Water and Thames Water, they're both below that yellow line. So you might argue that they were significantly different. And that's an interesting topic to talk about. Whereas, for instance, if you look at Bristol Water down here, Bristol Water took spot on the regulatory number. Not only did they take on spot on the regulatory number, but they took it in the zones as well. So they completely maintained their requirements and the regulations. Some of them, however, were using outside taps, and that had a resultant artifact on their data, which you'll see a little bit later. Interestingly, you'll find that the larger companies have struggled a bit more in terms of getting samples and having to use surrogates. There are a number of reasons why that is. If you've just got more samples, at the laboratory space, you're asking analysts to do analysis, so you've got to space these guys out, you've got to increase the day, you've got to ask people to go do the samples, and you've got large rural areas. And in some areas, for instance, particularly United Utilities, they had a second lockdown in that area, which meant commercial premises weren't as easily accessible and many were closed. And so we see that peculiarity. Interestingly, there were no surrogate samples for Anglian Water. So if we drill down a little bit, now I've used these two examples, Anglian Water and Northumbrian, Essex and Suffolk Water, because they give us almost polar opposites and how the companies approached it. So what Anglian Water did is they said, well, look, what we're going to do is we're going to take all our samples of the regulation and we're not going to use any surrogates. So we have a set of samples. They still suffered from the same effects of the other companies, where there was a reduction in the number of samples they could take over those most difficult months. Whereas Northumbrian said, well, we're not going to really take any samples out in the zones. We're going to take surrogate samples. Now, what effect has that had, and why is it important? Well, if you, for instance, if you look at Anglian Water, you have a duty for regularity and frequency. And what Anglian Water have tried to do is that they've tried to make it up towards the end of the year and haven't quite succeeded in making it up. So they haven't really met regularity and frequency. And whilst Northumbrian and Essex and Suffolk have met regularity and frequency, they haven't taken all the samples in zones, and they've sort of backed off on the last 3 months as they've tried to recover their operation at the end of the year. Now, are surrogate samples important? Well, there are a number of parameters which are taken in zones and not taken at works or reservoirs, which give us information about the networks, service reservoirs and water treatment works, and gives us assurance over the water supply. So, for instance, you might measure aluminium, manganese and iron, and that gives us real insight into what's happening, for instance, at a treatment works with aluminium. So there's real information that comes from those surrogate samples. On the other hand, there are samples which are largely derived from domestic premises, and therefore, by taking them as surrogate samples, that's gives us less information. Now, that's actually a really interesting point, because, as you know, about a quarter of the failures come from domestic premises. And if you look into the details of the sampling and what's happened, you get an insight into some of the changes in the parameters. So, for instance, if you look at Anglian Water, the majority of coliforms that are detected in zones are from consumer properties. And so, consequently, if you reduce your sampling, actually you reduce the number of coliform failures. Now, because Anglian Water haven't taken surrogates and they kind of made up for the sampling, the number of coliform failures that have reduced over this last year has been relatively small in terms of zonal coliform failures. But if you then look at, for instance, Northumbrian, Essex and Suffolk, they have a drop of 55% of detections of coliforms in zones. And that's actually quite important when you're starting to think about compliance statistics, okay, because not only do you have a drop in coliforms, but then you have a drop in E. coli and you have a drop in other domestic related parameters. And that ultimately would have an impact upon your statistic if you were using a percentile statistic. In fact, there is one company that actually had only one failure of a coliform in a zone in the last 3 quarters of the year. So profound was the difference in the way that the sampling was happening or was occurring. So I talked about profound outcomes from sampling, and one of the things is about lead, isn't it? Because lead is predominantly from domestic communications and supply pipes that lead into people's properties or people's properties. So you would argue, for instance, that there's no point in sampling upstream because you're not going to find anything. And in fact, many companies took that approach, because if you look here, you can see that if you look here, you can see that the majority of companies reduced down their lead sampling because it didn't really give any further information. So here, for instance, we have Anglian Water. They had a reduction in the number of lead samples they took by about 20%, and that's largely equivalent to the reduction in samples overall. But we come further down, for instance, to Portsmouth, which took 30% less. And ultimately, they had a complete 100% drop in detections of lead. And we see that in other companies as well, where there's been a drop in lead, a reducing number over that period, and a reducing number of lead. So actually, we see a significant drop in lead in terms of detection, except for Bristol Water. Now, you remember I said that Bristol Water took their samples from outside taps. Well, actually, they went to churches. They went to churches because the churches remained open. They were able to do sampling, and lo and behold, they had a 500%. Now, we couldn't put it on the graph because it would just shoot off the top of the graph and we couldn't see the other samples, but Bristol Water, 500% increase in lead. So it really kind of reminds us that lead hasn't just gone away just because we've gone through the pandemic and we've detected nothing. What we're seeing is there is still lead, and it's there in old buildings, and you can detect it. This graph down here, just as by the side, tells us whether they were carried out from surrogates or not, and you can see that Anglian Water carried out absolutely none from surrogates because there was no purpose. Okay, so moving on from lead, just coming then to the compliance risk index, because one of the things is that we want to look at the risk indices. We've had an unusual year with sampling, and we want to understand the validity of it. Now, when we looked at compliance risk index some years ago, it was a system that DWI's developed over 2015-16. I haven't put the 15 data there because we were in the experimental phase at that point. But as we drew this line of best fit, this was last year we were predicting that to intersect 2. In fact, we were predicting it to be intersecting at 2.05 to be absolutely exact. And it was on that basis and together with the median value that we understood and we could see that more than half the companies were below 2. And so consequently, there's a performance commitment in agreement with the financial regulator to put this performance commitment in. Now, we deliberately went down CRI because CRI is a measure that goes beyond mean zonal compliance. We know that mean zonal compliance from about 2004 has been about 99.95 plus or minus 0.02. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change, and it doesn't really give us any more information. So what we really want to do is we wanted to drive companies to improving their risk in respect of looking at the individual failures. And companies have really responded because what they're doing is they're looking at the failure, how important is that failure, what action needs to be taken, and they've driven that down. So whilst MZC has largely still stayed the same, actually we've driven that down. In fact, if you work out the number of failures, just by the by, there were 1,212 failures last year in about 3.8 million analysis. And if you do a quick division on that in percentage, it's 99.97. Tells you the water's extremely good quality that we benefit from England. But actually, MZC has been affected by, if you like, the reduction in zonal sampling because you have a reduced number of failures overall. Somewhere between 40 and 60% based upon the reduction in household sampling. Nevertheless, we're at 2.54, a median which gives us real indication of where companies are. At 1.6 means over half the companies, more than half companies are now making that performance commitment, and it's a real positive outcome the way that the companies have approached this. If we look at the individual companies here, we've got the 2 lines here. One is the performance commitment at 2, and the black line here, which is the national figure. For quick reference, everyone from Anglian Water and to the right is below the performance commitment, and everyone from United Utilities to the right is below the national figure, and that leaves Northumbrian, Southern and Bristol as the companies that are above the national average in that respect. So real winners this year, Severn Trent has moved down. Losers, Northumbrian and Essex and Suffolk, Sutton and East Surrey as well. So we've got 3 companies sitting here. Just to be absolutely clear, this is a big improvement because those 3 companies last year, there were 9 companies above the national figure. So we have really improved, and the industry has really improved. And what's more is that it's a real improvement because, as I was explaining, CRI is about the individual failure, and it doesn't actually matter where that failure comes from. It's about what you do about that failure. Unlike MZC, which is a statistic based upon an average taken over, so you are dependent on samples taken from zones and overall the number of samples taken. So there is an impact upon that. One bar that's missing from here is the Isles of Scilly. which has been taken into the Water Industry Act 1991, or there was an amendment of the Water Industry Act 1991, which meant that it came into southwestern Bournemouth supply area in 2019, and we have started to receive the first amount of data. We've kept the CRI separate there because as the company works out or is in the exploratory phase, we're starting to understand, and the company's starting to understand, what are the things that need fixing. If we had put a CRI up there, it would be 13.5 or thereabouts. And that's largely because we've seen coliform failures, we've seen some saline ingress for chlorate, and we've also seen radon, which is not really a surprise in that respect from that area, which the company will need to be working over the next few years to bring that into line before we merge that into southwestern Bournemouth figures. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the individual parameters. I talked a lot about coliforms in zones, and I talked about coliforms in water treatment works. A third of the CRI is made up of coliform bacteria. When you look down at the individual failures, you see that roughly a quarter is made up of coliforms in zones. So the swing for CRI is much more focused on the water treatment works where there's a higher risk, and the surface reservoirs. That's why we start to see coliforms up here, coliform bacteria in reservoirs, odour and so on, because there's a swing up to water treatment works, and that's why the contribution from zones is relatively small, and the contribution from how you produce water is relatively large, and that is why CRI is a valid figure and robust in this last year. And it's been a real test for CRI, and it has been a real testament to the robustness of this measure. Real improvements here, particularly around turbidity at water treatment works. This is unaffected by any element around the pandemic. We've seen a major drive down, which has improved CRI overall, as well as coliforms E. coli. If you look here, we have 3 E. coli in the last year. That's reduced from 4 last year, and similarly in surface reservoirs from 11 to 4. So there's a real improvement in E. coli. When we look at those individual failures, we have 3 of them which are due to ingress, 2 which are due to the sample line and sample, and 2 the companies weren't really able to pin down what the issues were around that. And it's really important to start looking at our ingress and what we do and how we go about it, because it's if we drive that ingress down in terms of coliforms, we're going to drive it down in terms of E. coli, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about individual failures. But overall, if we're looking at turbidity, that's been driven down by about a quarter this year. Iron has reduced down by about 20%. Lead itself has been reduced from about 69. I've explained the reasons for why lead is. You would actually think that nickel would be reduced down as well, but in fact it hasn't. Nickel has increased, and it's increased substantially, about a quarter up again. And you really have to start thinking about, well, what's happening here? Why are we seeing an increase in nickel, despite the fact that we've had a reduced number of samples in homes, and nickel really comes from those nice shiny nickel taps and those flexible connectors under the sink. Well, it's because companies have gone to commercial premises, they've gone to showrooms, industrial places, health clubs, shops and so on. In fact, in one case, it was a kitchen showroom one company went to where they found nickel. So we had a kitchen showroom selling taps which are coated with nickel. And that shift of companies to commercial premises has really highlighted some of these issues around nickel, and in some cases, taste and odour as well, particularly odour. And that was really emphasised by United Utilities, who really took this strategy to go to commercial premises and health clubs, and they started detecting odour. Having said that, a lot of the odour that we've detected this year hasn't been due to domestic premises, as companies have gone up and they've taken samples at reservoirs. And you can't then turn around, and if you get a taste and odour, you can't then turn around and say, oh, well, actually, it's a domestic premises. So what we've seen is we've seen a rise in the number of taste and odours associated with things like geosmin and MIB, which cause an unpleasant taste and odour from upstream algal works, where samples have been taken at reservoirs. And so that's led to us to having 10 enforcement notices. We had none in 2019, and now we have 10 in 2020 associated with geosmin and MIB. One particular, of course, was Hampton Load. There were 2 failures with odour. We know that site has a history of problems with geosmin, and the company know as well. And so what they did is they put in PAC dosing, powdered activated carbon. Really disappointing. On the second failure, the company had stopped dosing PAC because it was blinding the filter. So a real decision here of quantity over quality. And I keep mentioning, actually, you should never get yourself into the position where you have to compromise quality over quantity. And that kind of decision making is not really an acceptable decision in my book. So just talking about failures and some of the unusual things that we've seen this year. So for this year, we've seen copper, for instance. We saw it from Southern Water and Thames Water. In Southern Water, it's because they were taking a sample from a reservoir which had a long copper line. It sits in there all week. They've gone and done the sample, and lo and behold, you've got copper. Thames had a copper failure in conjunction with a lead failure, which was in their own mess. Staff mess, so they were feeding their staff copper and lead. Interestingly, they also found a nickel at one of their own kitchens, which resulted in then putting a notice up saying flush before use. I would argue that you should change the tap and not flush, particularly in a time when we're trying to reduce wastage of resource. Iron, I talked about iron and why that's important and why we were taking surrogate samples. So what we saw is some iron from reservoirs, some companies more than others, largely because there was iron building up in some of the sample lines or on the floors, which was then resuspending, and which the companies have then identified. We had one interesting failure where one company had gone to sample on a business park. Actually, it was their own business park, and all their staff had gone to work at home. And due to a change in velocity, due to some work, when they went to do a sample at their own office, there you go, you get an iron failure. So that was a real interesting failure in terms of COVID. I talked about copper, leads, taste and odour, nickel, all found at companies' own offices or businesses, because they were sampling at their own businesses. And what I would say to companies is actually you need to be up there and setting the standard in removing things like alkathene pipe, lead pipe, etc. And nickel and so on, so that you're setting the standard, because after all, we expect you to set the standard as the water fittings regulator for consumers. Okay, so that's a little bit on compliance failures. Let's talk a little bit about individual failures, and I talked about finding failures on companies' own premises. And so the highest contributing failure in terms of CIRI happens at Sutton and East Surrey own offices, in their own kitchen, actually, which was actually, dare I say, it was quite an interesting failure, because they took the sample, it failed, they tested the bottle again, it failed, they took another sample, it failed again. So there was a real problem there. Now, that, as I read the report, was quite a surprise for the company. It would be a quite surprise given the networks that they use. But what they had there, I suppose, is that they had calorifiers, dehumidifiers, all connected up to the kitchen tap which they were using, and that may have contributed. And I think the company certainly identified that. But it just goes to show that when you sample somewhere different, you suddenly find things for commercial premises, companies' own premises, and so on. I talked about coliforms. We've got Bristol there with Puckle Church. Really, here the company's had 3 significant coliform failures. They were all from reservoirs. They didn't empty or inspect them. It wasn't their policy. And, you know, really, it's about policy and procedures and getting it right at early doors, if you like, when you want to understand what's going wrong. So if you have coliform failures, that's an opportunity to have a look at the works, have a look at the reservoir, inspect it, see if there's any ingress, look around the edges and so on, because, you know, when we go to site, we find things like sodden, waterlogged tops of reservoirs, vermin, you know, animals on the site and so on. So it gives you an opportunity to look at that. And if you're reducing down your coliform failures, and it's difficult to reduce away all your coliform failures, taking that opportunity ultimately means you reduce that E. coli failure, which then, of course, comes from fecal contamination. So just looking at some of the other failures there, we've got Northumbrian Water, Horsley, Whittledean, Broken Scar. I'll mention them all again. They're completely on our register as a company. So yeah, Horsley, Whittledean, Broken Scar, just to repeat them again, Rochester, Burness, Barsham, Redgrave, all familiar names really for that company. Here at Horsley, we've got ingress, same with Whittledean. Horsley, big cold water tank on site, originally couldn't get into the tank, and the company had to retrofit hatches. They're not the only company to do that or have to do that to get in. They can't take it out of supply. It's a risk that the company need to deal with. We know that they're working on it. Same Whittledean, ingress in this instance, but this had a different problem earlier in the year where they had a power failure, so we cut the works out and actually ultimately bypassed their GAC. But and Broken Scar, nothing particular to report on the coliform in there, only for the fact that Broken Scar figures in a separate event. What I would say about all of those is in some of the cases, such as Ashford Common and Kempton Park, these are big works. So when you detect a coliform, it has a relatively big score in terms of compliance risk index, and you've really got to stay on top of that and to ensure that you're mitigating those risks down, which companies are doing, and we are seeing that in terms of an improving CRI year on year. It's that strategic thinking that we're asking for. Okay, so I talked a lot about Northumbrian. I've said that as a company we're very interested in it. This year is the first year that we haven't been able to separate or aren't separating Northumbrian from the southern Essex and Suffolk, and so consequently we were usually able to see the problems with iron and discoloration up in the north and microbials in the south. Interestingly, the domination coliforms in E. coli dominates this. Again, there are a number of works issues which we're working together on the company, and as you are aware, they're number one in terms of the compliance risk index. Again, as a contrast, I put Severn Trent here. Now, this was a company that one of the early companies that we had discussions on, some of the difficulties that they were having in terms of their compliance. And what we have here is that we had real high-level strategic engagement by the company to start looking at what were the issues and what could they do. And you can see on this bar chart in terms of their treatment, and this, I have to say, was largely to do with coliforms, E. coli and turbidity, but the company has focused on this in a real strategic way, and you can see this halving almost of the CRI, all down to the water treatment works, because they're saying, well, what's affecting the water treatment works in terms of CRI, because the water treatment works add so much to that CRI, we need to sort it. And in fact, I talked about the reduction in turbidity. Well, at water treatment works, well, here it is. it's this reduction in turbidity that the company have worked on tirelessly to reduce down that turbidity and make it a fraction of what it is. And so as they've pushed down this turbidity, because remember turbidity was way around on this side, as they push that down, it starts to visualize the company as a forward strategy. So what we're starting to say is now we can start to see that the company have some iron issues as well, and that kind of creates that widening of that pie so that the company has that strategic thinking about what's their next challenge. And that's why CRI is such a powerful measure to understand where that strategy of a company needs to go. Okay, so moving on to the events risk index. This one index is similar principles to compliance risk index, which you'll all be familiar with, so I won't give an explanation again about it. It's a bit more variable because the number of events usually is about 550, and when we're looking at compliance failures, we're looking at about 1,200, 1,400 failures, so it's about half as many, so have a greater variability. So here, this was largely driven by Southern Water, Northumbrian Water and United Utilities in these years. But overall, what we've seen is this median line, which is a really good measure of variable data to give us an idea of improvement. And we can see year on year that this is reduced, and we're now less than 10 for the ERI measure, where we were about 30 or so around 2017. So what we can see is we can see discernible improvements. Remember this, there was no measure for events prior to 2016. We back calculated 15. There was no prior measure, and so this gives a real focus for companies to act upon. And if I was drawing a line a best fit, I'd probably be saying, well, actually that's coming down and maybe that's leveling off. But if we look at all the companies together, every company here has improved their ERI over last year. So there is a consistent and complete improvement by companies, and that is why we've seen that reduction here in terms of the national ERI number. Everyone from Northumbrian to the right is below that national figure, and Anglian Water and everyone to the right is around that industry median. So really well done to those companies, certainly down towards the Anglian side and to the right, and well done to those other companies who've improved below the national level. I've split the axes here for Southern Water because that goes up to 2,800, and I'll explain some of the issues around why that score is quite large for Southern Water. Okay, so quickly moving on to the makeup of events in ERI. Top line there is we've seen a reduction in number of events. Now, the number of events we get, I've talked about 550, is really consistent. And in last year, what we saw is in the first quarter, March, April, we saw real consistency in about 110 events to an average of about 113. So there's real consistency that quarter. And then after that first quarter, we see a drop in 25% of events. And when you dig into it, what you're starting to see is actually there's a reduction in events. And it's difficult to say is it the same for every company because all different companies have acted in some way different. But in fact, in one company, for instance, what we've seen is a complete cessation of discoloration events where work has stopped. So as the country has stopped and gone home, no intervention in the network, companies not working themselves in the network, third parties are not working, hydrants are not being used, there's not draws by industry and so on. And so what we've seen is a generalised reduction, often not to do with the companies themselves, but as an artefact, if you like, of the pandemic. Just moving on to some of the events, this is the biggest contributor, the Hardham Southern event is, and that's really because of the number of people that's supplied and the length of it has gone on. And similarly, we've seen Real Chillerton from Southern Water. So we have two big contributors here. I'll come back to the Cripsvidium a little bit later. So if I look down, just drill down on this picture here. So these are three events that have happened at Southern Water, and just grateful and acknowledge the pictures that have come from Southern and the openness in that respect where we've received those. So it's, can you spot what's wrong with these? Okay, so I would say there's two of these that you should be able to spot. Maybe one will be a little bit harder. So they're harder in terms of hardened. That's going to be a bit more difficult to spot. But let's start on the left-hand side here. And this is all to do with Regulation 31. Now, Regulation 31 is really important because it's about materials in contact with water so that it doesn't impart any contamination, taste and odour, etc., etc. So there's a real focus on those products which you can use. Now, in real Chillerton here, we have a contractor who's decided to use a seal. Now, it was on an upstand and it was outside the reservoir, and you might think, well, actually, you wouldn't need to do Regulation 31 here. But the seal that they've used on this upstand is then gone a bit liquid and it's dropped down into the reservoir. So this is where water would be, and that is the residue of that sealant. Now, I'll quickly add that there was no effect on the to consumers, but it reminds us actually whatever you use on a water treatment works or a reservoir, Regulation 31 really needs to be the top of your mind. Here, this is a high lift pump, and that goes down to the sump, and that carries water up from the sump to the high lift pump. It is drinking water going through there, and that should have been stainless steel because that's Regulation 31 approved stainless steel. The contractors on the site who were doing this job didn't have stainless steel, so they decided to excuse themselves from it and put a non-Regulation 31, and that was in place for some time, hence the large ERI score. And this goes down again to contractors. So there's two examples here so far of contractors. Got plenty more contractor issues where the company hasn't quite spotted the contractor issue or the third party. Here, dare I say, this would be much better if we were doing a physical meeting where people could chip in. But can you spot what this is? And if you can't spot what it is, it's actually cardboard. And cardboard is, of course, not Regulation 31 compliant. Now, how did it get there? Well, the company commissioned a UV reactor, contractors came along and fitted it. It started to be problems with shutting down the through flow, and when the company looked at it, lo and behold, the contractors hadn't removed the packaging from inside the UV reactor, so not Regulation 31, and has actually affected the supply in terms of the sufficiency of supply by the stream shutting down or causing the company more problems than it should. So the real learning point here is about maintaining oversight of contractors and what they're doing, because they don't always understand why it's critical to use a proper sealant, why it's proper to use stainless steel hose. I'm sure they would have understood that they needed to remove the boxing and cardboard from inside the UV reactor. Okay, so coming along to discoloration here. Well, look, 16% of all events are due to discoloration, and this is really important because, as I said, you wouldn't sell a bottle of milk that looks brown now, would you? So you don't really want to sell a pint of water or a litre of water which is brown as well. One of the things that's really important to us is about the customer experience from their water, what they receive through their tap, because often when people receive discoloured water, that's quite disturbing, and they ring up in the company to complain about it. And if you look here, apologise for the granularity of the picture here, but where you have the dark blues, the darker it is, the more consumer contacts you have per thousand, greater than 1.2 in the blue, and where you have the black dots, and the bigger the black dots, the bigger the ERI measurement, or the bigger the event. Now, you don't need to be a statistician to look at that graph to say, do the events where there's discoloration occur in the place where consumers are complaining? Because you don't need to be a statistician, but we did it anyway. And would you believe there's a correlation between discoloration events and where consumers complain? Now, because of that, what we've done is you can see down here, you can't see it in some of the other areas, apologies for the picture again, we've got this sort of hatching here, and this is the hatching gives us an indication of the high complaints, and where we've put some notices in for poor performing zones. And the idea here is to drive improvement, because if we drive improvement in consumer contacts, we drive improvement in reducing discoloration and discoloration events, and that's really important. And so we've got some hatching that goes over here into Wessex, and obviously up into the Northumbrian and United Utilities area, because it is key that we drive this down, and we would ask companies to make sure they do put it in their business plans when it comes to discoloration and dealing with that. So talking about events, and you'll recall I talked about broken scar. Well, here we go, up in the Northumbrian and Essex region. The company, due to operational reasons, increased the flow from this water treatment work greater than 10% the conditions level of the main, and lo and behold, there was discoloration. Intervention by United Utilities in the Manchester Ring main, slightly different than normal. They did it at a different time when there was peak flow from all the other time, discoloration. Cheese Cross electrical valve stopped working. There were 9 bursts associated with that. Potentially 1.8 million consumers. That's quite a number. Discoloration, and they're all in areas where consumers generally complain. So there is a connect between events and discoloration. Okay, so talked a little bit about Cryptosporidium. What we've seen is we've seen a number of what I would call detections, if you like, low-level detections, not at a level that you might be concerned, but nevertheless any detection is concerning, requires action. So Little Hempston, we've had 2 detections in that's southwestern Bournemouth. We had, interestingly, a detection, but which wasn't a detection, from Yorkshire Water and ICUP Water Treatment Works, where the company detected crypto-like bodies. Now, these are bodies which pose as Cryptosporidium and fluorescence. Really difficult for analysts sometimes to spot the difference. They had 6 detections, and then they called the public health officials to talk about it. Ashford Common, we've talked about that. That was in relation to a cuneiform failure. Difficult, really big works, difficult to focus down on what's exactly happening. There are a number of little things, nothing specific, but you know, it was a good thing they removed the dead fox off the top of the filter. Whittle Dean I talked about, that was the GAC bypass. So Northumbrian works, Northumbrian, Essex and Suffolk have a number of works which they have challenged us over in terms of the log removal, amount of removal efficiency, of which GAC is included as part of their remove efficiency. So one of the things you don't want to do is when there's a power outage is to bypass one stage of your works, or for instance in Franklaw where we saw some substandard work on contact tank, again by contractors. So it's an observation of contractors, so that's come up several times. The issue here, I think the big learning here is that there was 3 reports by Badenoch and Boucher up to about 1998 to review some of the big Cryptosporidium failures from the late 80s and 90s, and they made a number of recommendations, things like turbidity, linking turbidity to Cryptosporidium, running to waste, the recovery of water to the head of the works. This is kind of what I call the 555 rule, or my 555 rule, where less than 5 NTU, less than 5 milligrams per litre suspended solids, less than 5% of the oocysts to raw. Some people will call it 10-10-5. There is some debate about what's the right thing, but what you don't want to be doing is returning that up to the top of the works, because that concentrates any oocysts. And of course you want to protect your service reservoirs and your filters, and you want to work in collaboration with your health colleagues. All of these were recommendations in the Badenoch and Boucher 23 years ago at least. And what I would say is the big learning, please make sure that you are focused on complying with the recommendations of a report that is over 20 years old and is still true today. Okay, So down here we've got some interesting COVID-related events. There were probably about 3 that I put in this one. One is the Southern Water, which was probably the first one, which had a big burst affecting potentially 12,300. Company did everything right, really. You know, they got all the bottled water out. The issue for them is that at that particular period in the early part of the pandemic were a number of people who were shielding, and they couldn't access the data from the Department of Health of who those people were shielding, and that created a real issue about being able to get that bottle of water to those people who couldn't necessarily go out. Real point of learning there about increasing your vulnerable database and keeping that dynamic. Further one where actually the event started before the pandemic. Started with taste and odor, if you like. A company have turned up, couldn't discern anything, come back, realised that there was a problem with an industrial unit, put a double check valve on it, still didn't solve the problem, changed some mains. But actually by then all these industrial units had closed down and the company couldn't resolve it because they couldn't get into the industrial units. And yet all that time, potentially, those industrial units, fortunately empty, would be continuing with a hydrocarbon contamination. And finally, the Sutton misconnection, which we cautioned the company for in this instance, because this was a case of where the contractor had gone to connect a supply pipe for a consumer because they had changed their part of the pipe from lead to a non-lead material, and they asked the company to change their part of the pipe. So the company went out to do the connection. There were other people working around the site. It was day of the or the day after the Prime Minister's announcement, and they couldn't track back the ferrule of where the original connection was to the 4-inch iron main, and so they guessed, and they connected it to a disused gas main. So there was some luck that it wasn't a live gas main. Nevertheless, as the company were dealing with some of the issues with themselves with COVID in terms of their staff having to relocate and work from home, if you like, some of the communication broke down as the consumer started to ring up and say, well, look, I've got a real problem with taste and odor. Company had to visit twice more before actually it was resolved. The first time they just flushed it through and said it was okay before coming back and realizing actually it was the gas main that they connected it to. So they redid that, and so there was a real panic there where someone has contractors again have left the site because they were worried about the announcements. And it's about prioritisation, isn't it? It's about prioritisation. We understand that there was issues with COVID, but there are equally health matters when you deal with drinking water, and there needs to be a discoloration. And the last thing I'm going to talk about contractors is the Leicester discoloration, and this was actually in 2018 where the company was remediating just over 6 kilometres of main, but forgot 25 metres. What they were doing is relining and slip lining, and when they opened it, there was a discoloration and taste, which the company sent to their consumers, and we felt that we needed to hold the company to account in this on this occasion. Okay, so I've talked about discoloration. And you know, overall, whilst I've focused on one of the things about this report is that we focused on a lot of the detail about where things have gone wrong, because ultimately that's what we do. We try to find out what's the issues and how can we fix that. That's why our water is such good quality, and that's how we increase and continue to increase that quality. It's why we use very innovative measures such as the ERI and CRI. So we can see here that companies have year on year reduce their discoloration, and so they are working on it, and that's commendable, but as a regulator we are going to keep pushing you, and I'm sure you would expect that to be the case. Just to put that into context, okay, all companies have improved their contact rate or reduced it, whichever way you look at it. They've improved the contact rate overall, so that's a big well done. The particular note is South Western Bournemouth. Always was to the left of that graph, the bookend, if you like, and is now for the first time the second one along, although don't get too happy, because when you're talking about discoloured brown, black and orange, actually South West is still to the left, because you can see the little blue bars just a little bit higher than United Utilities. So, but it is a big well done for South West, and it's a big well done for all the companies. But it is really keeping you and holding you to account, because if we look up here, I talked about a number of notices that we've put in highlighted for 2020 review. We are going to keep holding you to account, and we have put these in. It needs to go into your business plan, and for a company like Wessex, which probably hasn't improved more than it might well have done, you're moving up the table because all the other companies are moving down, if you like. Okay, so look, audits. We carried out 54 audits last year. 3/5 of those we actually did on site. From an organisation, a regulator, we feel it's important that drinking water quality remains high priority. My staff, I'd like to thank them for the commitment over last year going out to site and looking at places like groundwater, reservoirs and so on. We did take precautions in terms of the way we worked and the way we test our staff and whatnot, to make sure that we are not part of the problem as well. And understandably, we've done a couple of desktops, which I've got to say has caught a couple of companies short. Particularly when we've looked at disinfection, we've started to look at some of the policies, procedures, water safety plans, all sort of supporting information behind that. And actually, we found things like CT calculations don't stack up, monitoring pH, chlorine set points are not right, calibration equipment, poor risk assessments, as well as things like mechanical failures where they fail open but not shut valves, for instance. We've identified there are instances where service reservoir inspections are greater than 10 years, short circuiting, which can occur. Here's a great example of that. Here's a reservoir. What's wrong with this picture? If you're water industry, you might get this right, but here we've got the outflow and the the overflow and the inflow at the same height. So when it's overflowing, it's also close the gap, if you like. Probably a problem with your water fittings regulators would notice that. And the outlet is right below the inlet, and so consequently the water comes in, goes straight out, and actually all the rest might well remain stagnant. So these are things that companies need to do when they look at internal inspections, and that needs remediating. I know this one has been remediating. Just a general appearance on site. So this is the water flow channel next to the RGF. You can see it's a bit it's not as good as it might well be, because there's sediment for line there and there's sort of organic matter around there. So it's the appearance really here that kind of gives it away. It's not what you want it to be greeted for as when you're going to inspect a site. But what I would say, there's no particular common theme, but we do see problems with fences, we do see problems with vermin. I've talked about fox on the slow sand filter. We've gone to places where the topsoil was just sodden with water, feces, and what's actually interesting is down here, the public buildings. Actually, when we look back at records, companies weren't testing public buildings, or it was disproportionate that public buildings weren't tested. This year there's more public buildings, so we see more issues with public buildings. So we said to companies, look, if you've got to look at the proportion of public buildings, you've got to sample those randomly but in proportion. And delineation, because your water supply zone is supposed to be a consistent zone. It's not a zone if you have two different treatment works and they're two different pressure zones, and then you call that one zone. So again, it's small things, but it's important when you look at things like delineation and understanding that water quality. Lots of information in the report for you to read over the 4 quarters, get an insight. Now, my enforcement team, and I'm really grateful to my team last year, they produced 103 new legal instruments, and that amounts to about half the population of England that those notices cover. And there was all sorts of notices about there. So the majority, if you look at the 42 Regulation 7, so these are the notices permitting variation from randomisation for sampling. We talked about that. We've got 19 notices there still sitting there in terms of catchment and risk for metaldehyde. The metaldehyde will cease be is banned from next year, but obviously the risk exists because those who apply it may want to use up their stock. So we see that's quite important till at that moment passes that we understand it, although the number of metaldehyde failures is one, I think, this year. So it's really well done to water companies for dealing with that in the catchment, and that's a real improvement in terms of dealing with metaldehyde, particularly for something that wasn't easily removed. Some really interesting undertakings, some really innovative one. Anglian Water, they have closed their notice on water and buildings, and part of that was providing leaflets, and we've given lots of examples of that. So really burning the trail to deal with water and buildings. Portsmouth Water, a real innovative one about volatile organic compounds, particularly because they're in a rural area and they have a lot of gas and oil tanks. And so they've put into it about free inspections, 50% grants, giving wireless monitoring, advice and whatnot. So that's really, really positive about how the companies can apply themselves in terms of catchment and how they can improve things. But it's fair to say that the enforcements are over a number of topics, from data to documentation, from disinfection to discoloration, risk assessments, training, policies, and so on. It's really important to get the policies and training right, as we've highlighted in the audits, because at the end of the day, when we get into a situation where you can't sample, you are entirely dependent on your policies, your procedures, and your water safety planning to get it right. Because we produce high quality water, we know we produce high quality water. If we have those policies and procedures that are behind that, then actually, if we do what Anglian did and say, well, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the number of samples in the zones, and they actually did that. They've applied for a monitoring variation for cyanide and mercury. But if you do that, then you have confidence, because you're saying, well, look, all my procedures, my water safety planning and my ASREV, etc., is all in place, and I have real confidence, because sampling at the end of the day only tells us as a small snapshot whether that water quality is in fact high quality. But well done to companies really here. Now, I want to talk a little bit about recommendations. Recommendations, something we introduced again from about 2015, another one of my team's strategies about how we look at things in terms of a first level regulatory intervention. You can see my team have been particularly active from about 2016 to 2018, 2020. There's been a rise in the number of recommendations. Doesn't mean that water companies are any worse. It means that we're more focused on looking at events and audits and compliance and whatnot, and getting it right up front, early on, proactive. And here we can see where the recommendations are going. What I would say is that there are some losers and there's some winners here. Northumbrian, Essex and Suffolk, 14 times increase in the number of recommendations. It's largely because we've started to focus on the company. And again, I'll tell you a little bit why that's the case. Portsmouth as well, we focused on that, and that really was around their water safety planning, drinking water safety planning, and some of the elements around there, certainly in one of their treatment works around aluminium, and they were detecting that in the zones and what that meant for the treatment work. So really interesting there. So where is our recommendations coming from? Well, you know, it's coming largely from audits. Okay, this is actually an increase from last year. The events is about the same. Compliance is reduced because obviously companies are taking more samples from their own premises, which ought to be 100%, i.e. no failures at all, because it's totally in control. You shouldn't have any failures. That's the theory, isn't it? So the number of audits, it's increased by about a third, and reflects the activity of my inspectors. Again, thanks to them, we've got this information. If we look at some of the details, what we see is a lot of it's around sampling treatment management. I talked about getting the risk assessments and the policy and procedures, the operations and the investigations right. You've got to get it right up front. If you get it right up front and you get it right at this stage with recommendations, then actually what we're not doing is we're not enforcing, we're not taking any further action, because that's about better regulation. It's getting the industry to do it right for themselves. But it does go to the point of you've got to get the risk assessments right. So, look, size matters for companies because bigger companies will receive more recommendations, because obviously there's more to look at and we spend more time on those sites. So what we do is we do, again, another regression analysis, and this gives us a real insight into what companies are doing, how they're behaving, are they reducing their likelihood of regulatory failure. Up at the top of the red line, above the red line, these are companies we've got our eyes on because they're attracting higher recommendations. You can see Northumbrian and the Southwest has gone above the red line. Southern and United Utilities are perennials up in that red line here. Really good news here is Severn Trent, which is for the first year come down almost bang on the expected black line. So big well done for Severn Trent. Real drive from the top there to get that right. Okay. So talking about transformation programs, these are about putting a framework of notices and things in place to improve our already great water. And I've talked about Severn Trent exiting this plan. That's really evident because you can start to see that as we've put our focus on Severn Trent, because we were thinking, right, there's some issues here. We need to really look at what this company's doing. We need to put our inspectors on focus, and our inspectors have really started focusing on it. And then the company started to take control, and they've started to say, right, how do we deal with this? What do we do? And water quality teams being empowered, and we've seen a real drill down of those recommendations. And if you look at the data of what Severn Trent are doing, okay, yeah, look, risk assessment. Okay, we talked about the big area of risk assessment. They've gone, right, what do we need to do? Well, we need to sort out the risk assessment, because if we get the risk assessment right, we get everything else right, don't we? And up here on the green here, it's training, isn't it? So they opened up their training academy, but you see the recommendations, look, that's going down. So this is a real indication of how the company have looked at those recommendations and how they drill those down. And consequently, as a regulator, we said, right, great, you're doing it for yourself. And consequently, out you come of the transformation programme. So we've got all improvements across all boards, ERI, CRI, recommendations, and so on. Look, so Southern Water, United Utilities, Thames Water have been in this for the long haul, particularly United Utilities. They've been in it for probably the longest of them all. And what we're not really seeing is a particular visible progress, but that doesn't mean nothing is happening. So, for instance, we know that their surface reservoir cleaning, they've done 72, they've got 60 in demonstration, so altogether 132 they've largely done. They've got 92 remaining. They've got to do some of the work around Badenoch and Bantry we talked about. It's a bit delayed, but they need to work on that. A couple of trials they've done in lead, really important that companies are starting to focus on lead. As they understand that lead is, not just an impact upon mental health, but also physical health. And so we've seen two zones, one where they've had 1,846 properties where there was a 7.6% failure, and they've replaced 46% or 856 of those properties with lead, and the second one, which is much smaller, 71 properties, they've changed all of that lead, and now they're thinking about removing the phosphate dosing. Real plus, because if we're thinking about the future, reducing our chemical usage, sustainability, that's the big thing we want to do, and that's what we're as a regulator driving and endorsing that as well. Southern Water, yeah, they've realised that CRI is really gets you down to those roots to how you deal with it. And so they've done a CRI risk prioritisation. They've done 48% of all their actions across all the water treatment works. They've now driven down their service reservoir inspections to a 5-year average. Major improvements. What we're trying to do at companies that drive down that inspection. You drive that down, you're going to drive down the failures. So they did 167 cells in 2015. They've only got 25 left now that are over 10 years, and they've got to work on those. Thames, again, they've done a lead scheme. That's really good. 36,500 comms pipes. I try to push you further to the supply pipes, but they've done 1,800 assessments in schools, and they've replaced 450 lead pipes to those who are most affected by lead in schools. So that's a big well done there. So there is action happening in those who are continuing. New is Northumbrian. We've started to engage with Northumbrian. We raised it in 2019 about some of the risks around some of their major works. We've been out, boots on ground, done some audits. Some have not been pretty in terms of what we found. The company have keyed into what we're finding, and they're starting to realise that they need to work on that, and they've really engaged in this in a big way. And South West Water as well. Here we had a significant event audit where we looked at, and that caused a number of recommendations, and we started to focus on them as well. What I would say is that these work. We see real results. I have met on a regular basis the chief executives of Severn Trent Water, Southern Water, Thames Water, Northumbrian, Essex and Suffolk and South West and Bournemouth. And when you engage with those 5 companies, what I've had is real positive feedback, engagement. How do they deal with it? How do we go about it? And we see real improvement. And if you look, for instance, at Thames Water, you just can see that that senior engagement that was about 12 months ago really is starting to have positive benefits about how they're dealing with it. So we're seeing early green shoots there. And I would say with Northumbrian and South West, what fantastic engagement we've had there as well. Some of those meetings have been very, very difficult, but it's taking personal responsibility at the highest level. So well done there. I want to talk about risk assessments. Risk assessments hugely important. I've talked about having risk assessments because if you have the risk assessments and you resolve all the or as many of the hazards that you can and mitigate those, then actually sampling is just a verification of what you've done. Okay, now what I would say is that we engaged with the Drinking Water Safety Plan group from the water companies. Great engagement for almost all of the companies. Disappointing to see 1 or 2 where we didn't see that engagement or didn't agree with it. But from the vast majority, what we've seen is working together to get this measure right, because what we really want to do is we want companies to adopt in the Drinking Water Safety Plan as a living, breathing way of working and to learn across the industry. And so some of the recommendations from the Drinking Water Safety Plan groups where we've removed out and created consistency among scoring days in risk, because no point updating your risk assessment and it resets. For instance, the F categories as part of mitigation, which companies were using differently. So what we really done is trying to get that consistency to give us information. So I would endorse companies to continue working together as a collaborative group, because that gives us a real idea. It's a bit early to say. I would say that the unmitigated risks has improved from about 5.6 to 4. We can't determine whether that is a real improvement because of the model is developing. It's one of our later strategies. But nevertheless, there's wide agreement over what are the general risks. No supply, so burst mains, for instance, contamination of mains, as well as wide no supply. Lead, you can see this has doubled up since the last time, because companies are really focusing on lead. Equipment screening, we've talked about coliform and all of these things. So what we're seeing is we're coming together of minds of what the top risks are within the industry and how these may be dealt with. Now, we have done what you might term as a measure. It's not really a measure because it's understanding what that risk is. So if you come along here, we've got the median. So everyone from United Utilities to the right is below that median and so on, and a mean value. Now, these are not so useful here. It's more what I would call the bars at the end. You know, if you're a statistician, you might say the Z thinking here. So what's the deviation? So now it doesn't mean, for instance, those at the top left-hand side are poor performers. So, for instance, if we look at Bristol, what we have here is that we have the companies issue or risk around Purton water treatment works about their sludge handling capacity, and that could limit the water supply. So that's quite a big risk, and the company know about that, and they're working on it, and they've declared it in there. We've looked at it, we're satisfied the company are doing it. Portsmouth Water. This is about living and breathing water safety plans. So they've gone back, had a look at their water safety plans, and they said, well, maybe we're not using them in the right way. So this is sort of what I would call the discovery phase for the company, and we're really pleased to see that. Focusing down at the other end, I've got to say one of the best conversations I've had at board level was probably at Affinity Water. Fantastic discussion we had about water and risk, real understanding, particularly we've got a couple of gas industry individuals on that board who really get it about risk. But at the moment, what we're talking about is that all their risks are associated with legal instruments and nothing else. So what does that actually mean? Are they doing the right thing? Is this the document as it should be? Northumbrian Water, we know there are risks there because, quite frankly, we've identified about half a dozen plus works in the reservoirs which are going into the transformation programme and undertaking some to sort that out. They've moved from hazardous events to parameter race. So what we've seen is a sort of a reduction. So we need to understand that. So my team will be looking at that. Furthest to the right here, we've got Sutton and East Surrey with 23,835 lines with 2 risk lines, which were metaldehyde. They've recently added 9 lines on PFOS. What's interesting me here is that we have a company here where our recommendations to the company have increased to 20 plus from nil. We've got an audit which at Cheam we see a disinfection failures, which we discovered on audits. So there's a risk there. They've got an investment program around Godston due to a potential short circuiting of water and some regular equipment failures, which don't appear on that. And of course, we had the misconnection, which they were cautioned for. So is this a living and breathing document? Are we seeing risks? Really, if you get in your car and you drive, you have a risk you're going to have a crash. You can't have zero. It's very, very difficult. It's the realization that you have risk and understanding what that risk is and what you need to do about it. And that's what this is all about. That's the root of this risk assessment. Okay, so I'm just going to move off water quality because I've been talking quite a lot and you've been doing an awful lot of listening. So this is Network Information Systems, which is a new set of regulations. We've done 2 full years of looking at the company self-assessment. We've done a few visits out to see whether there is a director level connection with the understanding Network Information System. Overall, what we're seeing in the self-assessments is a general improvement, but we're also seeing companies as they're opening up the can, they're starting to see some of the issues, particularly some of the larger companies where they have a wider variety of assets and the age of assets, some older assets that don't necessarily interface as well, but newer assets, the software and the interface between the operation technology and information technology. So there's some discovery phase going on there. What I would say is cyber risk is hugely important to the water industry. We have seen a couple of instances over the last year, broad that is, one in the United States where somebody tried to take control of the disinfection dosing. So really, I just want companies to focus on this, particularly as they come up with their business plans, because cyber risk needs to be front and centre. Okay, so down the bottom we've got SEMD, that's the Security and Emergency Measures Directive, which is about preparing for emergency and maintaining your security. There was a closed consultation that went out last week, which talks about rearrangements of regulatory delivery, including DWI. As the strategic minds of the company, I'd expect you to be aware of that and know about that, and also, of course, be aware of network information so that you start to think about how you're going to do your business plans in the next couple of years to get that right. So just some final thoughts. I know I've been nattering on for an awful long time, and I just want, it's obvious, I don't need to emphasise that safe, clean drinking water is vital to public health and wellbeing society. There's none so more than this year when people were told to wash their hands. Water was critical to hygiene and cleanliness. It was critical to people's well-being, even if they were buying loads and loads of paddling pools. You know, you've got to keep that supply because some people just couldn't get down the shops to get it. And in fact, there were 1 or 2 companies who started refusing to deliver water. Why would you deliver water when you can get it from your taps in such high quality? So it is highlighted, but it also has highlighted the stretch. So we had a couple of incidents this year where, you know, that coupled with that 30% rise, we saw some stretch in terms of trying to supply. One at Thames Water at Blackdown, where the reservoir went down to 14%, and an issue around Sussex and Kent, where 44,000 consumers were put at risk just because of the demand on the supply. You can only get a certain amount of water down that pipe. So it's really important to plan for the future and how that supply is maintained, and you don't have those sort of near misses, because actually if you get the sufficiency right and you get the quality right, then actually you've sorted the issue. So getting those right. So always shoot to succeed, if you like, rather than trying to avoid failure. And really the industry is very much, in terms of drinking water, that is, in that space. We're really glad the engagement of some companies, Severn Trent, South West, Bournemouth, in terms of the green economic recovery. I'm sure I've forgotten 1 or 2 companies there. But it's really important that we consider drinking water quality as part of that green economic recovery. So, for instance, lead pipes, because it's the big picture of lead pipes. People think, oh, it's just lead pipe, but it isn't. It's a big picture about it. Some of the advances in water treatment and just putting spades in grounds really to help that recovery. DWI, we are involved in that. We saw this early as an early opportunity for us to just put on the table those things in water quality which really matter to people and are often forgotten in the sort of push for the wider environment, which is important, but we shouldn't forget water quality as well. And our inclusion in RAPID, which I have 2 staff working in there as we start to see national infrastructure to deal with some of the resource issues. That we've got to get that water quality right up front, and we've got to make sure that it's right, because at the end of the day, resilience of the industry is measured not just by its efficiency, but actually it's the quality of drinking water. If you get the quality wrong, you get the whole lot wrong. You may as well forget it. The other thing here is just crossing our minds. You know, it's only regulation's only robust when you're accountable, and I've given you a number of examples with contractors and so on. But it is that wider picture that you've got to have that regulatory reach to make sure that everybody is responsible for it, because it's no good. Delegated responsibility doesn't work. So when you're supplying water, and you want to keep that water at a high level of quality that we benefit from, then you've got to be accountable. Now, just the one thing about public acceptability here, look, I keep talking about the brown bottle of milk, okay, or the milk that tastes a bit sour. You wouldn't buy it, would you? Okay, so you're not going to want to buy water which doesn't taste right or look right. So public acceptability has to right in that cornerstone, and these are the things that we're highlighting certainly to the team in RAPID in terms of public acceptability. We're highlighting certainly to the policymakers about regulation and its robustness and regulatory reach, and we're talking about the drinking water quality and how important that is, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is strategically from the big picture is that we want an integrated solution. So we don't want the situation where we stick a treatment works, which may be a desalination, which becomes a white elephant. What we want to do is we want to have multiple solutions, such as catchment solutions, reservoirs, which all can be built upon in the future to make it a future for future generations that secures our supply and our resources. I just want to come back to lead. I know I'm just going on a bit, but it's not. Everyone says, "Oh, lead's just a nice lead." No, it's not. The societal impact of lead, and we've done some research of this, shows that there is an economic benefit to removing lead, because you improve your IQ, you reduce the impact from cardiac disease and cardiac and coronary disease and kidney disease, and there is an economic benefit of removing that lead. So that's big picture economics. Okay, big picture in terms of supply pipes. Well, the big picture is leakage happens in supply pipes. So if you're going to try and solve that, you may as well solve the lead at the same time. Or if you want to put meters in, well, if you're putting meters in, don't cut them into lead. Do it at the same time. So it's that thinking, that synergistic thinking, isn't it? Lead, leakage, meters, etc., that you need to really put that in that wider objective. And you can't ask the directing mind of a company just to think about one target. You've got to say, how do you fix this whole thing in one go, and in what order do you do it, and how fast do you do it? Because it's not going to be fast, is it? And finally, just talking about private supplies, look, 4.5% in England have fecal contamination. Okay, since 1989, there's been no financial provision for those private supplies to improve those private supplies to either a grant, or there's been no financial improvement to encourage companies to connect to those private supplies. And yet we seem to be happy that 1% of our population can drink private supplies. So what I would say to water companies, if there's an opportunity that's reasonable price to do so and picks up a number of consumers all in one go, then really you should be thinking of that as a societal objective and a societal purpose for the wider society. Why wouldn't you do that? And actually I saw one company this year who did pick up that idea and did want to run with it, and actually it's been quite difficult for them to do that. Why? Okay, so that's a final note, just to keep that in your mind. What I'll do is I'll stop there, because I've talked an awful lot, and I know that I've overrun it, and hopefully everybody hasn't been completely bored by it. There is a QR code up there. Or Laura, did you want to take over here about the QR code?
Oh, no, it's fine. Thanks, Marcus. I was just going to come in at the end. Yeah, so the QR code will be available for anybody who wants to give feedback on the presentation itself, which obviously has been extremely useful in previous years for informing so the content and the way that we run the presentation the next year. But I was just going to say thanks, Marcus. That's been extremely helpful. Obviously, you've covered a huge range of topics and touched on a number of really important issues for the industry. I think so much so that nobody's got any questions. Everyone's obviously been gripped to the screen. A couple of thanks, though, specifically for the acknowledgement that you made for the efforts by the industry to cope over the last year and to maintain sort of the supply of this essential service. And I think we've got a question here just from Liv asking if you'll be able to share what you believe will be in the strategic policy statement from a drinking water quality perspective.
Well, the simple answer is no, because I'm not the owner of the strategic policy statement. Obviously, we have put our views forward. We have made our views known. There's not anything in the presentation which we haven't suggested to our colleagues, but it really is up to policy, and it is up to ministers to decide what that should be. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And another question really about, I think what's been interesting is that over the last year, as you say, companies have adapted in lots of different ways, and they didn't all take the same approach in terms of maintaining some sort of sampling regime. And I've got a question here just to understand, is there a plan to sort of pick up on any of those lessons learned from our perspective in terms of the future use of fixed points, or a different approach to sampling for plumbing parameters or non-plumbing parameters to help sort of with the sampling efficiency and effectiveness? Yeah, one of the things I mentioned earlier on is about the provisions that exist within the regulation. And the regulations actually give no or little provision in terms of how you carry out those samples. They're very restrictive in that they say you should sample at a customer tap, and a customer tap is defined as one where you use for drinking and domestic purposes. So we're actually hemmed in by the regulations about what you can do, and that's why as a regulator we approached it in a way in terms of randomisation or removing randomisation of zonal samples. And looking back on what companies did to understand did the companies have any opportunity to change that? Could they change that? Was it force majeure? Well, arguably it was a force majeure that they had to do. Now, as we move out of lockdown, which our Prime Minister has talked about moving out of lockdown, what happens then is that we have to, as a regulator, abide by the regulations, as do the water companies, and that means moving back to the regulations, and that's what we will be doing. We'll be withdrawing actually information letter 1 to 2020 and 4 2020 and 1 or 2 of the other ones that we put up so early in the pandemic. That doesn't mean we won't stop talking about it. We think that there's been some real innovative ways that the company's approached it. I mean, it's just been so fantastic to listen to some of the chief executives working through this and how they, I mean, who would have thought doing a raffle for your staff was going to end up with samples? Now, that's still taking samples at customers' taps, and some of these companies actually achieved randomness. So they had regularity, frequency, and randomness, which is the requirements of regulations, while still doing it at consumers' taps. So that's the scope within companies to do that. But there's also Thames Water actually put 2,000 sample points on their register. So they started to build up a register. Where can we go? So when we, United Utilities, I mean, the example, not endless because it's a limited number of companies, but the companies did come up with how do we carry out this sampling. So there is scope within the regulations to have randomness, but actually you're not in a situation that maybe you have to knock on someone's door and the sampler is anxious and the householder is anxious. But at the end of the day, would a sampler be happy to go out, has a list, pre-arranged date, Amazon do it after all, that they can go to a sample, and just that little bit of lateral thinking within the regulation. Later on, for instance, if we can talk about changing regulations, and I like to try and persuade my policy colleagues that actually we should start thinking laterally as regulators, and what are we doing in terms of advanced technology? What is the data we're gathering? You'll probably guess by now I really enjoy thinking about data and working what that data means. So there's lots of opportunities about data in the networks that are being gathered. So does that give us an opportunity to gather that data from a measurement device direct to compliance? There is possibilities in terms of future regulation, but at the moment that opportunity isn't in place. So there's something maybe for water companies to start talking about if we get to the point where regulations are updated.
And I have another question actually, which is on a very similar sort of vein, which is to do with the fact you've highlighted there a number of issues or problems that companies came across by taking these alternative approaches. And there's a question really, are there any lessons there for the enforcement of the water fittings regulations as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there were problems. I would say there was an opportunity to learn information.
Okay.
And what we found is that commercial premises do have taste and odour, they do have nickel failures, they do have lead, even your own premises. So there is learning embedded in there that companies haven't quite got the fittings regulations right for themselves. Okay, so it might be okay to have into your site an alkathene pipe. But actually, shouldn't you be saying, well, actually, as a regulator, because you are regulators of the water fittings regulations, to improve that. There is some learning also for fittings regulations in that I think it would be wise to have a look at those fittings regulations, particularly as we're thinking around chromium and nickel and metals such as that some improvements should be in scope. But at this stage, what I'd rather do is, because I'm not the regulator for fittings, is commit on what I think those should be. But yes, is the answer.
Excellent, thank you. Well, look, thanks very much to everybody who's participated. Obviously, thanks to Marcus and the team at DWI who sort of drove the technology for this and made it happen. So it was really excellent to see you all here. Really good questions. And with that, I think we want to draw it to a close.
Laura, I just want to say just one last thing, apart from thanks very much to the industry once again for attending here, but I did want to make sure that I extended my thanks to my team at this point, because they did work through all of last year. You will see the extent of the report that we've produced and the detail of what, and that couldn't have happened without the team behind me. We couldn't have done this audit. So it's a real, I just want to put on record how thankful I am to the team at DWI and also to the water industry for supplying water to my tap every day.
Thank you. Okay, I'll draw it to a close then. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.